Hello and welcome back to Lois and Morgana Davidson Art. It's Lois here, and today I've been in the studio painting this demo for you. I've tried to show how using large brushes and a limited palette and keeping your brushstrokes to a minimum is a great way to keep your sky looking really fresh. I've used this photograph as inspiration. You can see I've lightened up the sky quite a bit but kept a lot of the drama. I've also removed the reeds that you can mostly see and revealed a river. If you're interested in details about the photograph and a downloadable copy, then the details for that will be in my Patreon, so please follow the link below. The first thing, of course, is to simplify the scene and draw it out onto my watercolour paper. I'm using Milford cold press watercolour paper. It's taped to my board, and my board's at an angle of about 20 to 30 degrees, so gravity will help with the painting. So I'm putting in my different planes of land, roughing out where my distant and midground trees will be, and of course where my river and foreground trees will be. For me, this simplified sketch is one of the most important parts of the process because it provides me with a roadmap to follow as I paint. So as you simplify your own photographs, take time to think about the position of all your elements. Try to think about using the rule of thirds for your composition, so that my trees are about a third in from the right, and they are my main point of interest that leads the eye around the painting and up to the sky. So having them just off centre like that is a really nice way of creating a nicely balanced composition. Just before the demo, a quick reminder that if you haven't seen it yet, my new book, Landscapes in Watercolour, Techniques and Tutorials for the Complete Beginner, is available to buy from all good bookstores. I'll leave a couple of links in the description below if you're interested in taking a look. Feel free to pause the video here if you'd like to refer to or copy the sketch for your own painting. I'm going to be using the wet in wet method, so using a large wash brush, I'm going to paint in my sky. I'm being guided by the reference photograph, and I'm painting in the sky with clean water, so I'm avoiding areas where I want lighter parts of the sky and brushing the water in where I want the darker parts of the sky, bearing in mind that I want to have the clouds coming in following sort of the lines of perspective, so that I get a really expansive view of the clouds rolling in from the distance. Once I've got my page wet enough and leaving it to soak in a little, then I'm going to start off with some raw sienna, and the raw sienna will give my clouds that sort of ominous sort of afternoon stormy glow. So I'm just putting in a light value of raw sienna across where my lighter clouds will be, and then putting some of that across the land so that I reflect some of that glowing light in the land. This is tube consistency paint. I've dipped straight into it, and it's sepia, Payne's grey and indigo, and I'm putting it straight onto the wet page where my darkest clouds are. You can see it's beginning to soften and diffuse, and as the paint runs out on my brush, then the value of the paint lightens. Oh, I can dip in if I want some darker paint, and really all I'm doing now is just dancing the brush around, trying to create something similar to the sky that I can see in the reference photograph. Keeping it nice and dramatic with nice big clouds at the top, because of course those are overhead, and then as we go back into the distance the clouds get paler and smaller. So now I'm bringing some of that lovely rich colour created by indigo, Payne's grey and sepia, dragging that across the river so that I get those storm clouds reflected in the river, and this helps to build this atmospheric painting. Keeping my brushstrokes horizontal so that the water stays nice and flat, and that contrasts really nicely with the very wayward organic brushstrokes that are creating my sky. the brush strokes may look a little random here. The whole thing may look a little bit strange, but I'm following my sketch, in other words the roadmap, almost exactly. So my sky is painted, I won't need to touch that. My river is mostly in, I don't need to do much to that. And now I'm just going to put in my foreground sort of bit of land at the front. This is a mixture of raw sienna, raw umber and burnt sienna. Just sort of bashing the brush really into the paper just to create these kind of blotchy marks. Just spreading that paint around, keeping it really loose. As it dries, that should just create the impression of a tangle of sort of wild grasses and reeds at the edge of the river. This is a clean damp flat brush and I'm using it just to soften back the edge of those rivers there. And of course that river goes off into the distance. And now continuing to follow the roadmap sketch, I'm using that same dark mixture and the corner of my Princeton Aqua Elite 1.5 inch Mottler brush to rough in some really loose brush strokes that will suggest my midground trees and my distant trees, the ones that I penciled in at the beginning. Again, softening back underneath these to integrate them into the rest of the painting where needed with the 1/2 inch flat brush. This is my palette knife and I'm pulling it through that really rich paint, and it's scraping a mark back to the white of the paper in some places, but where the paint is still quite wet, it creates an indentation. The paint goes into the indentation, so I get a dark line. I can then change to a sharpened stick and pull this through the paint and more or less sort of draw in these beautiful marks for my branches, trunks and twigs. I can finish this off later in the wet on dry stage when I come to paint in with the darker colour, but this sets me up with some really nice, very spontaneous and fresh tree marks to start with. I can do the same with these trees over on the right. Once I've sort of made some adjustments to the riverbank and then lifted out a little bit of light reflecting on that dark water with a clean damp flat brush. Every now and again I step back and I see what needs to be done to it without it being overworked. So I'm trying to keep the work that I do to this painting to a minimum. I'm scraping through some grasses and sort of marks using the palette knife in the same way as I did for the tree. You see it's scraping back in places. In other places it's dragging the paint forward. It's making lighter marks, darker marks, a nice variety of marks. And now here come these midground trees, scraped through in exactly the same way. Just a few marks to start them off, to keep them looking nice and fresh and well integrated in the painting. This means that when I come to finish the painting off using the wet on dry method, as I said before, I only need to do a few sort of painted marks to pull the painting together. Decided I need to drag a few more branches through the paint there just before it dries. I'm now going to lay the board flat because the paint is where I want it. I don't want any more sort of horizontal run. So by laying it flat, that means that the washes should dry pretty much where they are at the moment. I'm going to sprinkle a very small amount of fine ground ordinary table salt into the damp paint in the foreground. Each grain should produce a little tiny bloom in the damp paint, which will give me some subtle effects that will contribute to the something and nothing effect of the sort of wild grasses and seed heads and flowers in the foreground. I'm now going to leave it to dry completely. That's the end of the first stage. So here's the dry painting. It's back up at my preferred angle, which is about 20 degrees tilt, and I've just used a dry brush to brush off any grains of salt that didn't dissolve. But everything's looking okay, so now I'm going to continue using the wet on dry method. I'm just brushing a bit of burnt sienna and raw umber across here and there, just to bring a little slight glow back to the scene. So it's a slight glaze of very thin colour over the existing bone dry wash. And so the rest of the process is simply a matter of trying to bring a little bit of definition to the washes that I put into place in the first half of the painting. With my small calligraphy brush, but any small round brush with a good point will do, I'm going to paint in some slightly stronger branches and twigs for these mid-ground trees. Just a few little rough marks here and there. We don't need to do too much, just to suggest those mid-ground trees, working around the marks that I scraped in earlier. And now to work on these three larger trees. The marks that I made earlier with the palette knife and the stick, I'm working around those, incorporating them into the painting, using this mixture of dark paint, which is sepia, Payne's grey and indigo, and painting in and around the marks to create slightly stronger trunks and branches, and to sort of thicken out the canopies of branches a little bit more. Maybe add a few hints of leaves here and there, but I want these mostly to be bare winter trees. I'm using a fairly dry mixture of paint, so that as it runs out on the brush, I'm getting sort of dry brush strokes, those sort of hit and miss brush strokes, which are quite effective in portraying what I want them to in these trees. It's nice to bring a few details from the tree canopies out into and over these lighter areas of the sky, because then they contrast really beautifully against those lighter areas. And I shall continue to work across these three trees in the same way, building up the canopies. And then using that same dark colour, building up a few darker sticks and twigs and some little shaded areas in the foreground and along the riverbank. And now that's finished, I'm going to remove the tape and have a look at it and see how it looks with its clean white border. When you remove the tape and see it like this, it looks more finished, and so you can better judge whether or not you need to do anything else to it. Never worry if you think there's things that you could have done better. That's what this is all about. Nobody ever produces a perfect painting, but we try our best and we learn from the paintings that we make. In this painting, I'm really pleased with the sky. I think it's dynamic and I think it works really nicely. It's not overworked. The brush strokes are really fresh as well. But the thing that I don't like is that I think my three trees in the foreground are too close together. They're too evenly spaced. I would like to see a slightly different rhythm to the spacing, if you see what I mean. Maybe 2 together and 1 further apart. Something like that, or maybe just a different bend to the way the trees, or a different weight to the trunks. But I could make those changes if I choose to. But it's always good to have a look at the painting with a critical eye, not a judgmental one, but sort of a constructively critical eye. And this will enable you to make good, positive progress on your watercolour journey. If you found the video helpful and if you enjoyed it, it'd be great if you could click on the thumbs up button. And if you're new here, then I'd love to invite you to subscribe and become part of our community here on YouTube. It's free to do, and it really does help to support the channel. And as always, a special shout out to everyone that supports us on Patreon. We really do appreciate you. And if you'd like to support us that way, then please follow the links below. And don't forget to check out my book if you haven't taken a look. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.